Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from Pro Football Network. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, are there any press conferences that are scheduled during Monday Night Football that don't end in a train wreck?
I can't imagine. I mean, even in a scenario where a press conference is called by one of the more sane billionaires that exist on the planet, of which you have to grade on a curve, I imagine, there's no way one called by Jim Irsay would be one that is completely on the rails, that makes you think, everything is in control.
Yeah. Decisions are being made in completely rational ways. And we should all be thankful for it.
Happy about this. Yeah. But no, I doubt that there are many NFL level press conferences held during Monday Night Football that presage good events.
It was amazing to just watch on, because we couldn't find the link to it. Most people couldn't find the link to it, so we were just watching the Twitter updates. And some of the sentences that were being said out of it were definitely a collection of English language words. But we'd never seen them in that order before.
Certainly not combined in such a fashion. In many ways, this is called poetry. I do not relish any scholars in English departments for any task to break this sort of thing down. But certainly this is a form of poetry.
Of all people to be on the Pat McAfee show as the news breaks, it was Ian Rappaport who reported that who was being interviewed at the time to say that Jeff Saturday had just been hired as the interim coach of the Colts.
What was McAfee's response? I need to hear this.
It was a very it was a slow it was initially confusion, but within a second it turned from confusion to, well, I know Jeff Saturday, he's a good dude. I'm going to clap for him and say, good for him for getting it. And then without any form of irony or sarcasm, Ian Rappaport proceeds to ask McAfee if he missed any calls during the recording that they've been doing, implying that Irsay probably tried to call him too to see if he would get.
Had McAfee not been recording, he could have been the head coach.
That was an all-time moment. And on Mondays, sometimes I catch a little bit of McAfee, whatever. I never watch the Rodgers things anymore unless we're doing a Patreon review of it or something. But I never watch the Rodgers stuff. But today, I wanted to see what the thing was, because the Colts had just fired their coach. This will be interesting. If they fired Frank Reich, great. And then they get the hiring of the interim on there, and McAfee's trying to talk himself into it halfway through the show. But at that moment, he's slowly clapping, oh, well, that's interesting news. Great.
Right. Yeah. I mean, credit to McAfee, right? That's a friend of his. He knows him. He's worked with him for years, and he was surprised, and he found a way to keep his cool. So
yeah, Ian Rappaport asking him if he missed any calls while they were recording.
That's so good.
Easily, Rappaport's really good at that sort of thing.
That's funny as hell.
Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well. We have a game to review. The Vikings were successful over the Washington Commanders, and we've got a lot to talk about as a result of it. We also have a fantastic mailbag as well. But before we start, again, thank you guys so much for listening to Norse Code. We have a live show coming up on November 17th over at the Union 32 Craft House in Eagan, Minnesota. Check us out. It'll be about 7:30 or so. There's plenty of drinks, plenty of food. We're going to do the show, and we have not just one ticket to the game, but thanks to the wonderful people at Pro Football Network, we have 2 tickets to give away to the game itself on Sunday afternoon. So, if you are interested in the game, if you're interested in Norse Code, check us out 7:30 p.m. over at Union 32 Craft House. It'll be very obvious where we're going to end up being set up. There's a big mirror over in the corner that they're going to set us up at again. So check us out, Union 32 Craft House. There's no tickets to go into the recording, but you should head out. There's going to be some Patreon people there. We're going to get some regular listeners. There's fantastic drinks. Check it out. Union 32 Craft House. If you would like to financially support us, otherwise, you can go over to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. Special thank you to Beth Harrington for joining us over at Patreon. Thank you so much. For $3.50 a month, you get access to the bonus material. You get access to the Discord, all of that. So check it out over at patreon.com/NorseCode. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well as a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up your wreath outfits for the holiday season. Do you need an ugly sweater? Well, let me tell you where you can get one over at norsecode.threadless.
The ugliest sweater, in fact.
It's got your face on it. I just want to point that out. Norsecode.
Yeah, I'm very aware of this.
Norsecode.threadless.com. We both gave we both gave Norse Code merch to our respective brothers this year, or last year rather, for Christmas. Yours was more than mine. I gave him a pair of the Christmas socks, and he laughed maniacally. Your brother tried to no-sell it on the idea that he just had an outfit now that had his younger brother's face on it.
I gave him so much Norse Code stuff with my face on it.
It was brilliant.
The socks inside the mug wrapped in the sweater.
It was. Watching the video of that was just like, and he just knew there was more. Every time he opened up something else, he just knew there was more merch with his younger brother's face on it.
Look what I've become. Look what you've mentored me into.
I learned it from watching you, Arshad. I learned it from watching you. No one else on the planet would appreciate that more. Well, if you would like to torture your siblings, check out norsecode.threadless.com and throw us a buck or two there. All right, all shilling aside, let's get into the review of the Commanders game. The Vikings were successful, and in previous years, it's been pointed out that this is the sort of game where everything goes wrong for the Vikings. And in a way, it seemed like it. It seemed like one of those games where you play in like Madden, where the game has just decided you're not going to win this one. No matter what you do, the dumb stuff happens. Maybe a ref decides to go full, turn his like hit you with the crown of his head, the sort of thing to knock you out. Like all the terrible things that can happen to you happen here, and the game just says no, you're going to lose here. But once again, the Vikings come back, and the Vikings leave Washington with a win. This is the unsustainable stuff is becoming sustainable.
No, it's just happening again. I don't know, man. You flip a coin, 5 times, it comes up heads, and you're like, well, that's not going to keep happening. If you flip a coin and the 6th time it also comes up heads, are you going to say, well, okay, yeah, this for sure is sustainable. Let's keep going.
Well, at this point, it feels more like one of those situations where, this happened. And it's not weird that it happened. It's just weird that now it's happened 7 times.
Yeah. I remember watching Case Keenum too.
Yeah. This is a team that's winning somehow. And whether it's through hook, crook, or magic, the Vikings have a lot to be happy about. They also have a lot to be not pleased about. But we have to start with Kirk Cousins, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Kirk Cousins had a good game. Some people were saying, and here's the problem, is that like he had, I would say, a good game that is being, I think, overrated by the fact that he came up big in a big moment, which obviously has been a criticism of his throughout his career. So it was good to see that. But I keep on hearing stuff like, this is the best, that we've seen Kirk Cousins play in a long time. And it's like, it's not even the best we've seen him play this year. I mean, everyone kind of seems to forget that week 1 was like an unmitigated good, right? That was just everybody played well. Kirk Cousins was playing out of his mind. Now we know the Packers are no longer the team that they had the reputation of entering Week 1 with, but neither are a lot of the teams that the Vikings have beaten, and they beat the Packers pretty emphatically, and that's what I'm looking for when I talk about kind of what I want from Cousins, right? Like, obviously, statistics don't tell us everything about a player's performance. If, for example, we're not accounting for drops or the amount of pressure that someone saw, and by the way, Cousins was under a ton of pressure in this game. That's like a really important element of evaluating his play. But if we're not doing a good job of doing that, then we'll forget that we can demand more of a quarterback like Cousins. He had definitely some great moments. This was one of the better games so far this year. I think that when we talk about kind of the problems with the offense and the problems with sustainability, this game is less of an example than a lot of the other games, for sure. Right. But it's still, I think, an example. I think that there's still more to unlock with Kirk Cousins. I think that in 2021, he probably had 4 or 5 games better than this. Right. Some of them were close games that the Vikings won. Right. But I think that we're at this point where the Vikings are on this weird magical ride that when the reason they win is because of something Kirk Cousins does at the end, as opposed to something that, say, Chris Boyd does at the end or Cameron Dancer does at the end, we're like forgetting a bunch of stuff that happened. I mean, the Vikings, like Washington's like not a good team, man. Like the Vikings scored 20 points. So like, I don't know, man. Cousins had a fine game. He had some pretty severe missteps. I think we want to correct for the fact that he was under way too much pressure. I think he might have been one of the most pressured, if not the most pressured quarterback of Week 9. So it's not as if, he's operating in the same category of evaluation that somebody like, who played well? I mean, no one plays well anymore, but who played well this week? There's someone like, I guess Josh Allen was under almost as much pressure, so I can't even say that. Like Joe Burrow or something like that on a good week versus Joe Burrow on a bad week, right? On a bad week, Joe Burrow has a 50% pressure rate, and a good one he has on a 29% pressure rate. Or like Lamar Jackson in this game that we just watched that had finally ended after a torturous affair where the Ravens just kept winning and the Saints weren't doing anything about it. It's not as if he has some of the same kind of pressure environments that he's being asked to perform in, but, I've seen him perform well under pressure before. I've seen him do that this year. It's weird that we're kind of treating him like, look, he averaged 6.6 yards per passing attempt. That's below NFL average. And I know, again, that these box scores don't do an amazing job, especially on an individual game-by-game level, of breaking down and apportioning out credit and stuff like that. And his PFF grade was actually quite good. Not amazing, but quite good. But like it'll take a lot for you to tell me that somebody who averaged 6.6 yards per attempt had a good game. There needs to be some extraordinary circumstances. Even on, for example, throws that he should have had back, the Justin Jefferson drop, for example, that everyone was talking about. Kirk Cousins threw a bad ball, and it made the catch more difficult. It reduced the number of yards. It increased how close the defenders were at the catch point when the ball arrived to Jefferson. There were moments throughout the game where he did not play well. But it's the reason the game was close has much more to do with like a weird moment involving the refs, some unusual bad luck against the Vikings than it does with Kirk Cousins not playing well. But, it still only scored like 20 points against a mediocre team.
Well, they keep looking at it. The way I've been justifying it in my head is that people are looking at the record more than they are his performance and saying he's never had a year like this. Like they're just ignoring his personal stats and be like, yeah, but he's leading them to victory.
Yeah, and that I totally understand. And there is something to be said about a Cousins, season where you have wins instead of stats. By the way, these things don't have to like trade off with each other, which is very weird. But there's something to be said about it, like a Cousins season where you've got wins instead of stats. Because he's been so good at producing high-level statistics without seeing that convert into anything above a 500 record. But the thing is, the elements of play that seem to matter more in close games. So, for example, his ability to play situational football, read the down and distance in a 2-minute situation, or his ability to kind of play a little bit off script and make sure that, hey, the read says I should do this, but my gut or my feel is that I should do this because I just have a sense that the defense is doing this, right? That kind of improvisational level play. Those are things that he was bad at before. The situational football he was bad at before. And now he seems to be pretty good at it, or at least improving at that. Now, if he can get back to his previous form on all the other stuff, and maybe he can, maybe kind of turning on one switch turns off the other one. But if he came back to being as good as he was at that other stuff, he's a great quarterback. Like if you solve Kirk Cousins' two biggest problems, and then he gets to keep all the other strengths that he had, he's a great quarterback. Right? We're not there yet. We could be there this year, right? And that's kind of part of the question about sustainability, right? Is that at the current level of play the Vikings have, my concern about their ability to sustain this level of wins is pretty high. But I don't think that the Vikings are stuck at this current level of play. I think that they can improve, and they're more likely to improve than get worse. Although now we're seeing kind of some injury regression, right? Because we're seeing, more players miss time. Dalvin Tomlinson, Cameron Dancer missed a little bit of time in the game. We're seeing less availability for players than we did at the beginning of the season. So there are some opportunities for negative regression, but for the most part, the wins are happening. I have seen bad quarterbacks win before and then not be able to turn that into anything. It's going to take a little bit more than a winning streak for me to say that the quarterback is playing well. It's going to take the quarterback playing well for me to say that. And again, one of the better games that we've seen over the past 5 or 6 weeks, not the best game that Cousins has had this year, not in the top 5 games that Cousins has had in the past 2 years, but much better game than the ones that we've seen in the past couple of weeks. And he drove the wins in a way that I don't think was necessarily true in some of these other games. But man, this 3 and out stuff is really frustrating to me. That if the offense could just they score in that opening, the Vikings are the league's best team on opening drives, right? They've scored the most points on opening drives. If you break it down in scoring percentage, they're third. If you break it down in touchdown percentage, they're first on opening drives, right? They are 20th in scoring percentage after the opening drive. You can't tell me that the quarterback is playing well if outside of the scripted session, the quarterback is playing poorly. The offense is not doing well, right? This is one of the better offensive lines that Kirk Cousins has had, certainly the best one he's had in a Vikings uniform. This is a great receiving core, and they're 20th in scoring percentage outside of that first drive. I don't know. There's just so much more meat on the bone, man. It's and some of this has to do with Greg Joseph is missing some of these kicks, and that's hurting your scoring percentage. But even if you only look at touchdown percentage, they're 17th. So it's not as if it's entirely on Greg Joseph. But yeah, the wins are great. You prefer the wins to the stats every time. And quarterbacks can and should evaluate themselves by wins, right? But the way that we out on the outside evaluate quarterbacks with an eye towards seeing what is going to be a big part of how they're going to improve going forward, we should take a look at this underlying stuff, how consistently they can produce first downs, how consistently they get into the red zone, and how consistently again, Cousins didn't have an enormous drop rate in this game. He had a completion percentage of 55%. Completion percentage, not a huge deal if you've got an explosive game, and you can make up for it by having high value completions, but they didn't have a lot of those, right? And one of the reasons is because Cousins is still kind of reading the field in really wonky ways that allows him to miss somebody like Adam Thielen on a crosser, or miss that read to Jefferson that turned, Jefferson could have dropped it either way, who knows, but it really gave Jefferson a significantly less space to catch. Cousins contributed to the drop. I think that's inarguable. If you want to say that Jefferson, when he evaluates himself, should put 100% on himself, and that he should, catch the ball because he was able to put 2 hands on it, yeah, fine, sure. But your job as a quarterback is to maximize your offense, put the ball in the best place possible for your receiver to catch the ball, make sure that the odds of you getting yards are as high as possible. That means making the ball more catchable, leading it away from defenders, all of that. Right? He didn't do that. He made the ball significantly less catchable. So I don't know. And that's just one throw. I'm using it because there's a lot of discussion about it, because my critique of the throw blew up on Twitter. But there are a lot of moments throughout the game where Cousins probably could have done a lot better. And it's weird that we're talking about, I don't know, we've seen better from this guy. Like it's not like I hate Cousins. I'm talking about all these great performances he's had in the past, right? It's more like it is weird kind of the barometer that we're at. And I think you're right, James. It's because the Vikings are winning games, but I've seen enough Vikings football to know that that's not enough to think that they'll keep winning games. I've seen a lot of Vikings football where I know that that's not enough to keep winning games. I keep talking about the 2016 season. The 2017 season is just as good an example, right? They had a much better defense. It was a lot less turnover reliant than, say, the Jaguars defense that year. But they relied on such low probability plays, these like contested catches to Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, and yeah, man, I don't know. I've seen a lot of winning Vikings football that when you scratch underneath the surface doesn't look like there's a solid foundation there. And that's what this looks like right now. And those other teams where I've watched, where you look and you see that there's not a lot kind of holding that team up, those teams all collapsed, right? And so that's the concern. I don't care if the Vikings are like slightly better than the Andy Dalton Saints, right? That's not who they're going to be playing in the playoffs. Are they going to be better than like the Dallas Cowboys? Who could they be playing in the playoffs? Are they going to, be favorites to win against, some of these wild card teams that are actually not that bad? I don't know. Like if the Vikings are sustainable, then the Giants are sustainable, and then you have to play the Giants. I don't know. It's a weird situation. I don't know. They beating Taylor Heineke and Skylar Thompson and Andy Dalton like that. That's not telling me much. Like they went up against a good Philadelphia Eagles team and they got trounced. It's the only evidence we have. And now they might not even go up against a good Bills team.
Well, the Bills thing is interesting because as Josh Allen is getting looked at for his shoulder, or no, it's his elbow. Apologies, his elbow. Yeah. That defense was slowly becoming a mash unit last week, and so this week it's just it got a little bit worse too. So, but we'll add to that. We'll add to that in a little while. But there's an interesting energy about this team right now, and I was talking to you earlier before we were recording that there's like a pants on the ground energy right now involving Cousins. And anybody who remembers the 2009 season, right after the playoff game against the Cowboys, like peak Favre in a Vikings uniform. This was the high water mark. It wasn't Favre in Green Bay. It was winning the playoff game against the Cowboys to the point where they benched him by the third or fourth quarter and let T-Jack finish out the game. This was a game that was never in question. And Favre after the game did the locker room celebration and just starts screaming pants on the ground because that was the thing that had come on American Idol a couple of days before. And
pants on the ground, looking like a fool with your pants on the ground.
Yep,
yeah, I remember.
Screaming that. Slapped Jared Allen's butt so hard that he made Jared Allen scream. And then they went on to New Orleans. There's a lot of that right now. This is a fun team to watch after the fact, despite the fact that Adam Schefter did his best to ruin it tonight.
Yeah.
But
man, like
yeah. There's an energy. There's a positive energy about this team right now that is fantastic. It's fun. We haven't had a legitimately fun Vikings team to watch in I don't know how long. Like,
yeah, and they are so clearly having fun. It is fun to see and experience, right? Like, Zadarius Smith is clearly having like a big impact in the locker room. He had so much fun. Not just because he was playing well, but every time the camera was on him, he had this like incredible smile. Like he was just happy to be playing football, right? It helps that they were winning and that he individually was playing very well, of course. But like that is kind of like the infectious energy. Cameron Dantzler has it for sure. That's like fun to see. Patrick Peterson kind of in his own way, although he like has a little bit of a different leadership attitude than Zadarius Smith. Both effective.
The chip on his shoulder appears to be somehow bigger than Zadarius, and that says something.
Yeah, it's wild. I love it. I don't know. Yeah, they're playing with a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of fun. They have a lot of fun in the locker room afterwards. We'll see, if that continues. But like, it is a ton of fun to experience.
Yeah, my worry is that pants on the ground, it was the high water mark. That's where the wave crashed. So
Right.
I'm curious what the next 3 games for the Vikings is going to end up looking like. But we'll see. We'll certainly be there to cover it. But we'll see what it means, because I think the next 3 games are pretty much your bellwether as to whether or not you should feel like you should go all in on this team.
Yeah, I think so for sure. Like if they win like a close game against the Bills and a close game against the Cowboys, and I don't know, maybe a close game against the Patriots, right? If they win these next 3 games and they're all close, that is a substantially different conversation for me than the close game they just had against Washington, the close-ish kind of game they had against the Bears, right? The close game they had against the Saints. That's different, right? I don't respect the Bears as an NFL team right now. I don't respect the Saints as an NFL team. I don't respect the Skylar Thompson-led Miami Dolphins as an NFL team. I don't respect right now this current iteration of the Arizona Cardinals as an NFL team. They are not good NFL teams, and playing close games against those teams tells you more that team is somewhat similar in capacity and talent value than they are better or worse based off of the result of the game. But if you're close against the Bills, assuming Josh Allen is healthy, although that Bills team is so complete that it's still going to be tough to score points, assuming that the defense is mostly healthy, which it's not, but it's healthy enough to be scary. That tells me, I think, a little bit more, right? Like, okay, if you can be close with the Buffalo Bills, just like the Tennessee Titans just lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, this is, some of the most disjointed Kansas City play that we've seen in a while. But this, to me, in a loss, demonstrates that the Tennessee Titans are this year kind of legit, because they went under the radar. They entered the game at 5-2. You could make some of the same question marks. You can make some of the same, interrogations about whether or not the Tennessee Titans were legit in the same way that I've made it about the Giants and the Vikings. You could ask these questions: is this sustainable? Is this the type of football that's going to keep winning games? Are they in a bunch of close games? Have they looked unimpressive against bad teams? And I think that the way that they played against the Kansas City Chiefs, even in a loss, tells us that hey, when their quarterback is healthy, there is absolutely something there that'll allow them to be competitive against these really high level teams, not favored but competitive, and possibly win, especially if they have something like home field advantage. And that's what I want to see from the Vikings. I don't have to win the game against the Bills. That would help. But if they're in a close game and it's like a genuinely close game, not like a backdoor cover type of close, right? Which is kind of why, with the Bears, I was a little bit but like that to me would tell me, okay, yeah, maybe they can hang. Maybe this is something with the team. But yeah, these next 3 games, especially if we're seeing healthy quarterbacks, will tell us, I think, a lot more. And I guess technically the Jets, by the same barometer that we're using to say that the Vikings are a good team, the Jets are, quote unquote, a better team, I think, than the Patriots by record. And certainly they just had the Bills close. So, they, again, also have some of these same questions. Yeah, I don't know. It's I think these games are going to tell us a little bit more and help us answer some of these questions that I think have been very annoying for me to answer. Not necessarily just for me, but for people who watch, what I have to say and stuff like that. They're like, well, Arif, we get it. You've been talking about sustainability the entire season.
Last thing on Cousins for a bit. There was a moment that Cousins went down, and he said today in an interview that he got the wind knocked out of him pretty good. And he just needed a second to kind of compose himself, go back onto the sideline, catch his breath, and then come out and play the next game. This is a field that has eaten Vikings players for years. FedEx Field is known for being a place where injuries just happen. And Cousins getting up from that and it not turning out to be 3 broken ribs was a nice step.
Yeah.
Was a nice step in the Vikings' favor, I feel. It was just the wind getting knocked out of him. Great. That's
fantastic. More injuries at that level and less injuries at a different level. Yeah, yes, for sure. Especially Kirk Cousins has experienced, what injury can do to quarterbacks. Not directly. I mean, he got a job from it, but what injuries can do to quarterbacks at FedEx Field.
Yeah, somebody as durable. Say what you will about Kirk Cousins, the man's durable. He doesn't get hurt. And so when he went down for a moment, my only thought was, oh my God, FedEx Field took another ACL. Oh no. And they replayed it, and it was clearly just that he had been hit it like landed on awkwardly, and he was just trying to catch his breath or whatever. But like, I did have that moment of just, oh god, it's AP again. Oh no, this is terrible.
We got to see one Nick Mullins play, which for some reason was a pass.
Why was it a pass, Arif? Can we cover this from like 6 different angles? Why was that a pass? Why was that not just like a handoff? Why was that not? I mean, maybe a screen, but like,
you
why?
see, they were expecting a handoff.
There is something to be said about that, but still, like, really? The only person I'm scared of less when it comes to throws down the field is apparently Taylor Heineke now. And the one they showed it on Monday Night Football tonight. They showed the replay of that of that 46-yard pass by Taylor Heineke. It was like, dude, why are you showing the highlight from where the ref ran into the player? Not the player ran into the ref. The ref.
I had the sound off when they were playing it. This wasn't like a come on man segment thing. It was
they were showing it as a highlight to show that Washington to promote the next Monday's game because it's Eagles against the Redskins, and showing that they could like move the ball down the field. Like, dude, that was absolutely going to be a pick, and the fact that it wasn't is really upsetting in a couple of different ways, because the game should never have been as close as it was, but it was because of nobody touching the receiver, but B, because the ref launched himself into the corner.
Yeah, and like specifically the ref let himself in, right? Like that's the thing that like really grinds about it, right? Is that the ref wasn't running away from the action. He ran towards a player. And it's not like he intended to run into the player, but it's just like it adds like something extra to the frustration when it's like the ref is proactive in making contact with the player in a way that alters the play, as opposed to so many other instances where a ref and a player run into each other where the ref is not being proactive in any way. And again, not intentionally proactive, but like, word out for his actions, right? He induced it, right? But it's different than like when a player runs into a ref. It's like, well, the ref, maybe he's trying to avoid it. Maybe he's not. Maybe his eyes are somewhere else. That's just kind of part of the job. But that's not the ref's fault when the player runs into it. But this was just the ref's fault, right? There's not like a way around that fact. Absolutely wild.
How ridiculous. And the fact that there's not something set aside in the rule book for this is an unfortunate oversight. It was clear.
Yeah.
It was clear that this was not a situation where the player ran into the ref. This was clearly the ref running into the player, caused an interception not to happen, which then caused a touchdown to happen immediately afterwards. Like 7 points, well, 6, but 6 points were scored immediately as a result of the ref moving. It felt like the Buffalo Wild Wing commercials.
Yes, it did. It really did. Yeah, and like. If you were to think about it in terms of like expected points, right? Like what were the expected points gained by Washington, by Taylor Heineke on that throw? And that answer is probably 5, right? Just by comparing the down and distance before and after, and obviously after is a touchdown. But then you think about like the expected points of a potential touchdown there, and it's negative, right? It's probably -3 for Washington. So in some ways, it's something like an 8 or 9 point swing, even though it technically was, because it denied the Vikings a possession, right? Like that's the thing that's like really frustrating about it, is that the Vikings were denied like a response drive where they would have 2 drives in a row where they'd have the ability to score without having to worry about being scored on. And they got denied that opportunity. So it is the 7 points that they scored plus the however many points the Vikings might have been able to score on a pick, especially if he'd been able to return that pick, right? So it is a part, because it didn't go from incompletion to touchdown, right? It went from potential interception to touchdown. Like that is just such a huge swing, and I find it frustrating that there's not a means to deal with it in the rule book. And I understand that this would be something that would be like uniquely difficult to write a rule for, but that this case of what just happened would be an obvious example of even some of the more stringent versions of that rule. So I can believe it happened, but I'm upset that I can't believe that it happened, if that makes sense.
And of course it happened against the Vikings, because why wouldn't it?
Right, of course.
Just one of those things.
That's how the world works. You know this.
Well, yeah, listen, I sign off the show every week with something along these lines. Like we've been down this road before. However, all right, so the wide receivers were catching balls and everything, but the star of the game appeared to be TJ Hawkinson, who'd been on the team for 5 days, 6 days, and was in for 60 of 66 snaps.
Yeah, I think he had like 9 targets, 9 receptions, 70 yards or something like that. 2 or 3 of the receptions were like no yardage screens. So like I think that his actual performance on routes that he ran was pretty good. It was, if we take it's like 6 for 70 or something like that, it's over 11, which is pretty good for a tight end.
All thanks to David Blau of all people. Like good on David Blau.
Yeah, absolutely. Weird moment, right? But yeah, I mean, Hawkinson seems to be already figuring into the Vikings' plans. And the thing that's kind of interesting is if you take a look at players who are traded at the trade deadline, and then you take a look at their week 1 performance, or in this case, week 9, but the first week with a new team, it's generally like not that good. Bradley Chubb recorded 2 pressures and 1 half tackle, assisted tackle. He didn't get any solo tackles. He didn't get sacks. He didn't get he got 2 pressures, right? And they traded like 2 first-round picks or whatever for him, right? Christian McCaffrey in his debut from the trade got like 12 touches. They weren't bad touches. He did really well, but he only got like 12 touches. And as a running back who is subject to such a massive trade, they traded picks 2 through 4 plus a 5 next year for him, right? He's gonna have to feature in the offense in a bigger way than he did before, right? So you take a look, like Robbie Anderson's another good example. You take a look at these players that the game after they're traded, and they generally don't have a performance like Hawkinson did. So that is. And it wasn't just him like running these random routes. I mean, he was in their run blocking, and he was part of run blocking fits. He was in their pass protecting and like doing an all right job. Like, yeah, it is pretty exciting to see, potentially what Hawkinson can do if this is an example of what he might consistently be able to do.
It was fun to watch for sure. And the broadcast kept mentioning that Cousins hasn't had a tight end who could do any of this. And I just wanted to scream out, dude, Kyle Rudolph was here like 2 years ago. He's now in Tampa Bay not catching balls from Tom Brady. But like he was here recently. He won a playoff game for the Vikings against the Saints. He likely pushed off, but we don't talk about that.
Right, exactly. Now, the way that Lions fans talk about Hawkinson over the past 2 seasons seems actually pretty similar to Kyle Rudolph, in that they're really frustrated with how often he's asked to block and how poorly they perceive him to be blocking. There's a great red zone connection that's worth preserving, but he's primarily a receiving tight end that's being asked to do a lot. That's obviously not his reputation coming out of Iowa, right? Coming out of Iowa, he was this fantastic blocking tight end that was on the field primarily because he was blocking, and in his final year at Iowa, he kind of unlocked his ability to be a good receiving tight end. He's super athletic, not as athletic as teammate Noah Fant, but super athletic. So he's able to turn that into good receiving production, but primarily a blocking guy that figured out how to be a really high level receiver. In the NFL, I think we saw that for like a year or 2, but these last 2 years, it's very much more in that kind of Kyle Rudolph camp, where he's a big body in the red zone, that he can run a lot of routes. He's got pretty reliable hands, but man, why do we keep asking this dude to block? That's kind of where he ended up in his career. I think that can be resolved going forward, because I don't know, like it suddenly Dan Campbell takes over and then Hawkinson loses his ability to block. I feel like there's probably something in the coaching environment or being what he's asked to do that he's just not comfortable with, or something that can be resolved, and he could be more than Kyle Rudolph in a lot of ways. But the way that he was being used in this game, is similar to Cousins with Kyle Rudolph. And Cousins has had not just Kyle Rudolph in a Vikings uniform, but he's had like Jordan Reed and Vernon Davis in a Washington uniform. So he's had good tight ends. It is a pretty good pairing, him and Hawkinson, but it is weird to say that this is unique.
He looked like he was having fun. He looked like he was enjoying himself, especially post-game. He looked like he was enjoying a win, which is not something he's had a lot of to celebrate over the years. But what a fun addition. It was for a little while there when the Vikings were not like being very successful. I was just sitting and watching his routes and just like watching him cut, and it was just fun. Like until he gets hurt, he's great fun to watch. Like he's got that bug to him, but he's a hell of a lot of fun to watch. So good on him. We'll see what the Minnesota training staff is training staff is able to do to keep him on the field. But man, well, can we talk about why the Vikings were down for so long this game, other than the ref playing as the 12th man? Like it didn't make any sense why this Washington team was scoring points on the Vikings defense just based on how the defense held up the week before.
Yeah, and honestly, there's a lot of elements from this defense that were really good. I mean, Danielle Hunter had, I think, probably his best game of the season. Zadarius Smith was having a really fantastic game. But those are, given how injured that offensive line is, that is almost in the realm of expectation. Now, I'm going to say that if you kind of put a player of Zadarius Smith's talent level, or let's say contract value, up against kind of what he was able to, do up against, whatever Washington was able to field, he did so spectacularly better than what that standard would be. But still, that's part of the equation when we're talking about it. But the problem is sometimes that coverage in the back end didn't hold up. Cameron Dancer wasn't always, where he needed to be. And then after that, Caleb Evans took over. Evans, I think, did all right, but it just felt like there was something wrong with the way Jordan Hicks was in coverage or the way that Patrick Peterson was playing coverage that didn't take advantage of what the defensive line was doing to put Heineke in this spin cycle that he did not want to be in. So there were moments where it felt like the defense was not playing, very spectacularly. But if I'm going to criticize the offense for having only scored 20 points, I should at least give credit to the defense for only allowing 17. Not a good offense, not a good quarterback. This offense should not consistently be scoring something like 23, 24, or even 28 points, right? But still holding them to 17 is nice. It's just frustrating when you know that because of what that front four is doing, that there's a lot of opportunity for you on the back end. They didn't do very much with that opportunity.
The Vikings offensive line seemed to spend a fair amount of time on their back, along with Kirk Cousins, who was getting hit pretty hard. What happened this week?
So Ed Ingram continued to play pretty poorly. He's been playing really poorly all year. But one thing that I did not anticipate was how poorly Ezra Cleveland was playing, because he'd been having a pretty good season. In fact, he's been having a good enough season that I think in our last mailbag, someone asked, he's playing so well, is it possible that he can improve to the point where he could be a Pro Bowl level guard, right? We got a question to that extent 1 or 2 episodes ago. And that's a pretty decent, barometer for how people have been interpreting his play, to the extent that people would, care about his level of play. So he'd been doing well, but he played really poorly in this game, and that gave them all kinds of interior pressure problems that they had to deal with. And Darrisaw and O'Neal played pretty well on the edges, and they didn't give up a ton of pressure on the edges, but there was still a lot of edge pressure because of how much attention needed to be given to those interior players that were doing a ton. And so sometimes you're left in situations where Dalvin Cook is taking on an edge rusher, or TJ Hawkinson is taking on an edge rusher in pass protection. And sometimes, that led to edge pressure, or it took some players out of routes when it would have been better to have them in routes or something like that. So, the Vikings offensive line struggled a lot. A lot of that is just that interior. The tackles are playing very well.
Well, let's wrap it up with, I'd say, special teams, but we spent a lot of time watching the game, watching punts, just spectacular flying punts for long periods of time in this game. But we're not going to talk about special teams because Greg Joseph managed to hit the things he was supposed to hit. So apparently he's fixed. We can hope. Uh, really, the only thing I wanted to mention is that Justin Jefferson was able to get a touchdown in the end zone. This is important. He hadn't had one since week 1. And Thielen looked a little rough out there, but he was catching balls. But we have a mailbag question about whether or not he should be the number 2 receiver or whether or not Osborne should be the number 2 receiver. And I'm curious as to what your thought is on that.
It really does depend on kind of what we mean by wide receiver 2, right? Because it would imply like maybe in 2 receiver sets, right? It would be, Osborne out there instead of Thielen. But in 3, it doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, you can kind of manipulate it so that the progressions on a particular play go 1, 2, 3, and so your second receiver is going to be your second in the progression. But really, that progressions are I think more fluid than people kind of give it credit for, and they can change. The order of the progression can change based off of the structure of the defense you're playing against. So you can't really do very much. But yeah, who would I like to see targeted? I would still think that Thielen should be the one that ends up with more kind of designed plays or situations where he's a more valuable target or be on the field a little bit more often than Osborne. I think Osborne is playing really well. I made a prediction at the beginning of the season on podcast and on Paul Allen's show that that Thielen. That we could have a world where KJ Osborne outproduces Thielen in yards and Thielen outproduces Osborne in touchdowns. I think that is something that should be in the realm of consideration. But right now, based on the way Thielen is playing, no, I think Thielen is playing really well. He's getting open. I know that he's got pretty good hands. His contested catch rate is not up there where it has historically been, but that's kind of a low sample thing. It doesn't really bother me that much. I would say that in any way that the designation receiver 2 matters, you should keep Thielen as receiver 2.
Well, what else should we say about the game before we wrap up?
I guess were there any special teams moments that were interesting? It's been a while since we haven't had those, but I don't remember. Like we didn't have like a 90-yard punt. We didn't have a special teams turnover. I think that's the moment that like we're missing is that there wasn't a special teams turnover that we could sit and talk about. I debated calling up a friend and asking him to break down the punting for the game because there were so many. It was a clinic. If you were interested in the punt game and all things involving hang time, like we could have brought somebody on for that, and it could have been a very interesting. Well, I would have been fascinated. Everyone else would have been absolutely bored to tears. About special teams and about punting, but that was yeah. I mean, two very good punters were on display, playing some very good punting games. But it's not necessarily an ideal situation.
Yeah, you would prefer that the punter take the day off, quite frankly, and let the offense just keep moving. But that is not what was happening here. So. Well, let's get into the mailbag. We got plenty of stuff in the mailbag and a bunch of stuff about the game, so let's just get into it here. Sam asks, why is our screen game so utterly horrible?
I wish I knew. Like, this is kind of one of those areas where there's just not a lot of football writing done about it, and so it's like really difficult for me to go out and learn. But my sense, based off of kind of the way that defenses have been reacting to Viking screens, is that there is some type of timing that's off, and the timing dictates the spacing, and the spacing is what's allowing all of these players to dodge blocks and get into I guess what amounts to a backfield on a screen, but get it, behind the line of scrimmage and attack the ball carrier. Like, I don't think that there's, based off of what I'm seeing, like a tell, although that's important too, right? If your guard is coming off of the screen and is not even pretending to pass block, that is such a good tell to linebackers or even the defensive linemen that guard is supposed to pretend to be blocking, that a screen is coming. And that's a problem, right? You need to be able to sell the screen, especially with your offensive linemen. But based off of what I'm seeing, I don't think that's it. I think that the spacing and the timing are off. Cousins has to get rid of the ball pretty early, a little bit too often. So maybe it's the kind of the footwork coming off of the screen that's going to change the timing a little bit. Or, when the offensive linemen get out into space, they're getting out into the wrong areas of the space. I don't know, but it is consistently bad. And, in this game, felt like wasted time seemed a little bit generous. Felt like it was negative and backwards to keep doing it.
It was weird because this is like a strength of the Zimmer teams. It was the fact that our screen game was just so good. And now we're sitting and watching the screens just fall apart immediately.
Yeah. And I wonder about that. Like, I wonder kind of, is there something in the way that Kevin O'Connell coaches that, make screens a particular difficulty? Because they do open up other opportunities in other ways. And maybe there's trade-offs and like, hey, if you're going to run a motion heavy offense where receivers are going to go from the bunch side to the solo side or vice versa, those receivers are involved in the run game when they do that kind of jet sweep type stuff. But the sacrifice is you're not going to have blockers where you want them to be on screens. Maybe that's it. Maybe there's a legitimate trade-off here in the way that Kevin O'Connell runs the West Coast offense differently than, say, Shanahan or Kubiak, right? Obviously, in the McVay school. And maybe the choices they make sacrifice a lot of opportunities to get blockers in the right spots. That's possible. I kind of doubt it, but it does feel like, given how effective this offense can be in other areas, especially in the realm of play design, that it's baffling to me. It should just be better.
So very weird. Ryan asks, is this the proper complaint/suggestion box that gets the Vikings to stop throwing to tight ends from -2 to 0 yards from scrimmage?
Yes, this is the complaint box. Your complaint has been logged and registered, and I'll be forwarding it to, the interested parties for a remedy.
Yeah. Also, is Chris Reed Old English or German for the corpse of Drew Samia? Also, when did Cleveland forget what a stunt was? Was Ingram contagious? I know we keep saying it can't be worse than the current guard play, but criminy.
I wouldn't go like as far as to say Ingram is contagious. I don't know why Cleveland looked like blinkered on all of these stunts, but he's been pretty good about picking up stunts. He's had pretty good awareness. Maybe they saw something that they can occupy him as a looper, or they can, or as I guess as a penetrator to free the looper, or they can do this or that and make it more difficult for him to anticipate what's going on. Maybe he can see kind of blitz pick up a lot better than he can see stunt pick up because of the way peripheral. I don't know, right? But it seems like he's generally been a better at this from an awareness perspective. So I don't know what happened there. That was pretty unusual. But there's just kind of like a lot with this offensive line that feels like there's something that could just go awry, right? Like, is Garrett Bradbury actually playing all that well, or is that just going to, fall out from under them? I don't think that, like, when you take a look at somebody like Chris Reed, I don't think that you could say that he is reminiscent of Drew Samia because, in that situation, you had a player that really just hadn't played NFL snaps in meaningful games that once that finally happened, he was like a mid-round pick. Once that finally happened, people were like, oh, okay, I can kind of see why this didn't work out. With Chris Reed, I mean, he's played in a lot of NFL games, right? And he has played decently enough that Colts fans seem to miss him, right? And that is, pretty high praise when it comes to an offensive lineman. And so the Vikings' refusal to play him instead of, say, somebody like Ed Ingram, I don't think that that's because secretly he's as bad as Drew Samia and the Vikings were trying to spare us. If that was the case, I don't think they would have traded away Jesse Davis to the Steelers, right? Like, I think that there's something that the Vikings do like Chris Reed. They just think it makes more sense to stick with Ed Ingram, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think the moves that they've made and the history that Chris Reed had tells me it's like a little bit different.
Next question, oddly enough, is from Ryan, who asks, would the commies be obligated to give the back judge a game ball if they won? Unless I'm mistaken, that was the best block on that side of the ball. This is what a penalty-free quarter looks like in Madden.
Yeah, I guess that's basically offensive pass interference, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's always going to make those look pretty good. Um,
man, that was
yeah, I mean,
ridiculous.
I think that you'd have to feel obligated to provide a spiritual game ball. Pretty confident that if they gave him the actual game ball, that might spark an investigation. Which, maybe that sounds like fun on a Monday night, but I think for most people, maybe not.
Well, I mean, considering what they've been investigating involving the refs lately, and whether or not autographs were exchanged or information about golf courses or whatever the hell
Yeah,
was being
right.
talked
Yeah,
about,
that was so funny.
of all dumb
Yeah, man, he just
things.
has a really good. He's a really good golf trainer, man. That's what this was about. Just
Yeah,
talk about training for golf.
nothing
Yeah,
else.
dude, for sure. I bet.
Absolutely nothing else. Jack Rackham asks, if you could pre-record a 10-second video of yourself to be played at halftime on the big screen at Lambeau Field next home game, what would you say? I know what
Well,
I'd
James, I
say.
think. Yeah, I think you came up with a good one.
I think I would go on the screen and just say, "Hey, Packers faithful! Just a reminder that Zadarius Smith is being paid $11.4 million to be a Viking this year. Cheers, everybody!" I think that would be enough to just bring
That
everyone
rules.
down just a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just
That's perfect.
what a garbage fire of a team this year. I think that one of the reasons why it's so much fun to be a Vikings fan this year is the combination. Like if we were
Yes.
like in a fight to see who was actually going to win this division between the Packers and the Vikings, I don't think it'd be as much fun as being a successful Vikings team that keeps eking out wins and watching whatever the hell is happening in Green Bay happen live and in living color every week. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
The combination is really astounding stuff. I think and it's been forever since something like that has happened, and I think the fact that it's been forever, the fact that the Packers have been so dominant for so long that they entered the season as divisional favorites, like I think all of that on top of this collapse, on top of seeing Rodgers throw his own teammates under the bus, that really adds, I think, something else for sure. It's been a ton of fun.
I am kicking myself for not taking the Packers under and instead putting money on the Redskins, the Washington football team, the commies, the under for them and the under for the Bears. It's like
That's right.
I am very disturbed that I did not throw money on the Packers going under. That's a license to print money right there. Like it's so perfect. And they're stuck with them. They're stuck with them unless they can convince the Colts to go for to once again trade for an aging quarterback. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Justice
Yeah,
tweeted out
absolutely.
a picture of Aaron Rodgers in a Colts outfit today, and it is the most cursed thing you will see outside of Adam Schefter. So it's worth looking at, but only if you can print it out and then immediately toss it into a volcano to like rid yourself of it. It is a cursed item.
Yeah, it's brutal.
MJ asks, Hawkinson was on for 60 of 66 snaps in his first game and was an improved threat over the middle. How should we expect coverage of Jefferson and Thielen on the outside to adjust now that some safety coverage will have to be devoted to the Hawkinson threat in the middle?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on the routes that the Vikings want to run going forward. I don't know that, you were able to give them a full playbook. And so I don't know that, this is a great example of the field effect it'll have. I mean, this is a pretty good example of the production that he might be able to have with the Vikings uniform, which is nice. But in terms of the way that he's going to impact coverages, it really depends if they're going to try and use him to challenge seams, or if they're going to try to use him to kind of challenge linebackers, right? And so if he's going to be kind of more of an underneath guy that challenges linebackers that occasionally kind of moves upfield, that's probably not going to change coverage too much, except it's going to change kind of the secondary options that the Vikings will put into the route tree, right? Because if you've got Hawkinson, say, running a drag route, then you don't have Thielen running a drag route. He might be running kind of a levels concept right above it, right? And then you just throw to either Hawkinson or Thielen based off of which linebacker or which player the linebacker chooses to cover on that crosser, right? And that might change kind of how the safeties might feel like they have to nail that crosser and come down. That's going to create additional space for Jefferson on, like, let's say an over route. That is kind of the stuff that won't change the shell, but it will create new conflicts on the defense that'll create more space for whoever ends up catching the ball. But if, they do decide to, like, say, push Hawkinson upfield a little bit more, challenge in between, the two safeties and too high, because we're seeing so much too high, either in cover 4 or in cover 2 and occasionally in cover 6. We're seeing the split safety look where that middle of the field is kind of a little bit open. You can pull a safety in one direction with Hawkinson, right? And then occupy that open space with another receiver, hopefully somebody like Jefferson, so that you get more of a one-on-one situation with Jefferson. It actually, to go back to that throw that I was criticizing for Cousins, that is apparently living rent-free in my head now that I keep referencing it. That is a scenario where Jefferson was running, basically, it amounted to a corner route. It wasn't, but it amounted to a corner route. He is trying to be in the space between a safety and a cornerback, right? And he is going upfield at a diagonal towards the sideline, right? And so it's about a 45-degree angle or so, maybe 50, right? But he's heading towards the sideline, and then the throw cuts underneath it, right? The throw is ahead of or closer to the line of scrimmage than the cornerback, and so he has to cut underneath the corner. What I wanted on that throw, and I think what the Vikings wanted on that throw, is to lead Jefferson to the sideline, away from the safety and away from the corner, right? And that would have given him much more space to be able to catch the ball maybe over his shoulder or something like that and be away from the defenders. The reason I bring this up is because that safety coming over the top, right? That safety might have been what encouraged Cousins to throw it elsewhere and alter his throw. If that safety is 2 more yards away, then Cousins is probably more likely to throw that in an area that's going to give Jefferson the most opportunity for yards after the catch. And one way to bring that safety 2 yards away on that throw is to keep that safety occupied with a threatening tight end, maybe someone who's running up the seam and attracting the attention of the near safety, so that Jefferson has this corner route and the safety has this conflict in terms of who he needs to best cover. So yeah, I think that there are some opportunities there. I don't think Hawkinson is like Noah Fant or like a Vernon Davis in that he'll be stretching those seams on a consistent basis, but that's an opportunity. And you can always run, these sail routes or out routes that, flood zones, with one additional receiver than there are players in zone assignment. So against, for example, cover 3, where there's one safety in the middle of the field and 2 corners at either end of the deep field, you will very often run what's called a sail concept, where one receiver goes deep, one receiver goes to the sideline, and another receiver goes underneath that sideline receiver, also going to the sideline. So you've got 3 levels of throws for basically 2 defenders, the underneath defender and the cover 3 corner on the side. And Hawkinson could run that route. And, the Vikings have used a version of it where one of the receivers going to the sideline is actually coming from all the way across the other end of the field. And so you can adjust that route in a bunch of different ways. But having a player as effective as Hawkinson can change what the safeties do at the back end, or can create conflicts underneath that create yak opportunities for somebody like Adam Thielen, or for Hawkinson, who has a very weird relationship with yards after the catch. If you talk to Lions writers, they'll say, hey, yeah, his total yards after the catch are pretty good, but a lot of that comes on 1 or 2 plays. He falls down a lot after he catches the ball. So maybe it's there, maybe it's not. But it does change the way that coverage can operate, for sure.
Well, next question is also about Hawkinson. Loyal Stooge asks, to what extent could Hawkinson's production against Washington be due to the fact that there was no tape on him in the Viking system?
I think very little. Again, if you take a look at players that have been recently traded, they just are not very effective in week 1 after the trade, right? You sometimes will get a Christian McCaffrey. You'll sometimes get a TJ Hawkinson, but more often than not, you'll get somebody like a Robbie Anderson, who has, I believe, right now a total of -4 yards for the Arizona Cardinals. Or that's an extreme example. But you'll primarily get like 20, 30 yards. You're not going to get as many yards out of that player who just hasn't had time in that system as the Vikings happen to get out of Hawkinson. And given the number of times they targeted him, they should have gotten way more, but they're not good at screens, right? We just covered that. So yeah, I don't think that has much to do with it. I mean, I don't think he's going to get like 70 yards every single game. I mean, if he did, what a great find. There's a little bit of fluke there, but I think that for the most part, there's something that he showed that the Vikings are going to continue to try and, draw upon as the season goes forward.
Well, the next question is from R. Menson, who asks, is the significant improvement in the outcome of close games relative to last year an indictment on Zimmer, a credit to Kevin O'Connell, due to other teams making mistakes, or just random fluctuations?
I think, first of all, I think random fluctuations do play a role here. Now, a couple of times this week, whether it was on Kay Adams' new show with, gosh, I don't want to get this wrong, FanDuel, right? There's two competing media properties in the DFS space. You don't want to screw them up. But I think Kay Adams' new show, she brought this up. I've seen it a couple of times on Twitter. Not from people that like to dig into this stuff a little bit more deeply. For example, Crossorific and I have had a little bit of a disagreement about what counts as a one-score game. But from people who might be parroting something that they hear in broadcast coverage. Not their fault. It's the broadcast coverage's fault. But they're like, hey, the Vikings lost 8 close games last year. And it's like, yeah, they were in 14 of them. They tied the league record for the most close games in a single season. A little bit less impressive than the 2015 Ravens in a 16-game season, but still, they were in 14 close games. They were nearly 500. They were one game away from 500 in close games. So we're only talking about the losses for some reason. And so they were able to steal a couple of those losses and turn them into wins. Okay, great. Some of that is variance, right? Some of that is just, you'll get close game variance. But I did argue, right? I don't want to be dishonest about this. I did argue that the Vikings seem to be a little bit worse in close games than a coin flip should indicate that they should be because of Cousins' particular proclivity for textbook style quarterbacking, which doesn't adjust for situation, right? I didn't put much stock in like the idea that he like wilts under pressure or anything like that, but more he just plays football kind of the same way regardless of the situation that he's in, which drains the clock in like say comeback scenarios or leads to incompletions in hold the lead scenarios, right? In both of those situations, the completion is less important than the time saved in the first example, and the completion is more important than the yards gained in that second example, right? Because you want to drain the clock. So that was an issue that made me think that there is the possibility that they're actually a little bit worse in close games than a team mostly should be, right? This year, we're not getting that. We're getting somebody who's a little bit more creative, a little bit more willing to kind of pull the trigger on explosive plays. He hasn't connected on as many explosive plays as I would like this year, but in situational football, he's played with a little bit more situational awareness, right? But also, I would want to add that, the Vikings have, maybe a culture of not feeling defeated after they give up big leads. Again, if you kind of test this thing out consistently over time, it is like, it does go away. So I don't want to say that like this is definitive that the Vikings, used to be dour after giving up multi-score leads, and now they see it as an opportunity to win. I don't think that's it. I think there's been a big impact as a result of team culture around the building of the Vikings, but I think that resiliency that they show. I think that like from an attitudinal perspective, they did kind of have a lot of that last year. There is still something in slightly better game management, slightly better, challenge management and stuff like that from O'Connell than there is from Zimmer that again is playing what seems to be a kind of an outsized role. And it is very difficult to find a coach that's pretty good at late game situations in terms of clock management. But I think for the most part, this is variance. I do think that this team is better than last year's team. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I think that when I have this discussion about what the team is, my talking points pin the team below what their record is, and so it looks negative. But the team, and in some sense, it is right. But the team is better than last year, and that was the barometer for success heading into the season, and they've met that. Right, one of the ways they seemingly have met that is through this kind of close game stuff. But really, I think it's more that in areas where the team situationally seemed to collapse last year, like let's say at the end of halves, where they were the worst team in basically NFL history in the final 2 minutes of the first half, they are just not that team anymore, right? And I think some of that has to do with the coaching, some of that has to do, obviously, with just, again, randomness. But yeah, there's something here that is a little bit different than last year's team that tells us that the close game stuff plays out differently. But I still think that the primary thing that we should be thinking about when it comes to close games is that these are functionally, in terms of evaluating a team, not in the standings. Obviously, in the standings, it's a win. But in terms of evaluating the team, you learn more if you treat it like a tie than if you treat it like a win or a loss. So that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it. But it does feel like there's something different with the way this team handles these close game scenarios.
Damian Barrett asks, do we have enough evidence yet to prove that Kirk Cousins actually passed away over the summer, but the team contrived to cover up his death and replace him with a member of the backroom staff, possibly named Steve?
They saw how successful it was with Melissa, right? Mm-hmm. They decided to do it again. The glass tube broke, the rock spilled out, Kirk Cousins is gone, and he's been replaced with Steve.
Dude, Steve's got some swag and seems to be enjoying himself out there. So
yeah, Steve's not quite as accurate, but certainly he's got a lot more moxie.
It is funny watching all of the receivers jump, especially Hawkinson, jump for balls coming from Cousins just to make sure they hit him in the numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems to be a thing. Also from Damian Barrett, my wife and daughter are away for a week. Apart from a steak, what are your go-to meals for when you want to push the boat out for a dinner and not be left with a shed full of leftovers?
Very, very of the British Isles question, Damien. Push the boat out for a dinner. How often have you heard that phrase?
0. This is the first.
Okay.
But famously, I didn't make it to the UK this year, so I'm probably a bad person to ask.
Sorry.
I was, yeah.
I had a miserable time, James. I'm glad you didn't come. It would have made your week worse.
I'm sure. Let me be perfectly clear. I am positive my week would have been infinitely worse in a foreign country and not been able to leave the room, as opposed to just staying on my couch and being entertained by the blur happening on the TV screen. My son got me into this stupid video game that I eventually beat called Power Wash Simulator, which sounds just as dumb as it possibly could be. And I got into that because I just needed something to do for the blur to be interesting.
That game got pretty popular for a while. It's not just you.
There's a full storyline with it. It's so weird. There's aliens. And
that's a good reminder. I was going to get into that game. Thanks for reminding me. I'm going to get it now.
Oh, I 100% recommend it. If you need to feel some control in your life or some calm in your life, Power Wash Simulator will get you there. That said, yes, that would have been a far worse experience. As far as a meal that's not going to involve leftovers, what does she not like that you do? My significant others have all disliked Indian food. So if I'm the one person who's around, I'm going to go over and get a bunch of Indian food.
Yeah, that's a good call. I don't know that there's not a ton of stuff that Chelsea dislikes that I do. I mean, she has developed a few new food sensitivities, which I'm pretty confident are legitimate, not people who've suddenly decided that they have a gluten sensitivity. This is not me saying that celiacs don't exist. They absolutely do. But, there's a bunch of research into people saying that gluten sensitivities don't really exist in the same way. It's not like that. There's a bunch of stuff where we're pretty confident that there's some real food sensitivity. Because when I forget, right, and I put in an ingredient and she doesn't know about it, suddenly it flares up again, right? And so, one of those is roast garlic, not garlic in general, but the process of roasting garlic, because I think it's because it's slow, or so, I don't know. Um, we've stopped doing one of my favorite recipes, was an adaptation of the Alton Brown chicken and 40 cloves recipe. I've talked about it on the podcast a couple of times.
Yeah.
Um, but instead of using a whole chicken cut down, I just use a bunch of chicken thighs, which gives me a lot more leeway. But you put in a bunch of garlic, right? You roast it, and it's delicious, because roast garlic is like a butter of the gods, right? It is incredible, but it's not great. So that's something that I would make, but there's nothing that's like a cheat meal or anything that we like. We have very similar taste in food. She, I think, likes kimchi a little bit more than I do. That's basically where we differ.
She likes Indian food. Meanwhile, you've had enough of it in your life, and that's enough.
Well, okay, yeah, there's that, but that goes the other way. When I'm gone, she'll have Indian food.
There you go. Michael asks for Arif's regressionist corner. In the last years of Mike Zimmer, it seemed like the Vikings consistently lost close games, and that this season might be the opposite. How does a neo-regressionist explain these streaks, which should be randomly distributed? I feel like you already did, but I wanted to bring up the
neo-regressionist corner.
Yeah, the regressionist corner is important.
I will say for the randomly distributed stuff, what ends up happening is that the wins and losses in close games are distributed randomly throughout the league, and then they concentrate, because this is how random distributions work, they concentrate positively on one side and negatively on the other side, and you end up with teams like the Giants and the Vikings on the positive side, and then we ask individually why they don't. But if you take a look at a 32-team league, not everybody's going to have a 500 record in close games halfway through the season. In fact, most aren't. What you're going to have is a distribution where one team is nearly 100 in close games, one team is nearly 0 in close games, and then you look at that team at the 100 and you're like, hey, they're different. And it's like, well, yeah, of course they are. That's how randomness works. So, like, yeah, if you flipped a coin for every team in the NFL, 16 times, right? Every team has a chance of winning each individual game 50% of the time, right? Like, that's how that would work. But you'd end up with teams with vastly different records, right? You'd end up with a 13-3 team and a 3-13 team, even though if those two teams, quote unquote, played each other, they would be just as likely to win as they would be to lose, regardless of the previous record. That's what's happening with like these close games. We're looking at a team that's successful and asking why they've succeeded. We could just as easily do that with another team. That's how these close games are distributed.
Next question is going to be from Kenneth Allen, who asks, where does Jefferson rate as a contested catch receiver? It seems like there's a fair amount of balls that he should fight through and catch, but doesn't. Is this the weakest part of his game?
I think it is up there as one of the weaker parts of his game. It is interesting, though, because he was such a great contested catch receiver in college. I guess maybe you could say the same thing about TJ Hawkinson and blocking, but it was one of his strengths in college. I think he had something like a crazy 85, maybe 90% contested catch win rate, right? Which is just wild. The contested catch rate for Jefferson right now is quite low, and it has been in a Vikings uniform since he's arrived, relative to other high level receivers. But it feels like it's a weakness, but it's not something that, had I not kind of dug into, and I looked into it last year, which is why I was able to answer this one, I would be overly concerned about. Typically, this is stuff that regresses, but some receivers do have a consistently high contested catch win rate. Those receivers include players you wouldn't expect, like Tyreek Hill, players that Vikings fans are familiar with but don't fit the prototype, like Stephon Diggs, and players that absolutely you would expect and, in fact, turned out are pretty good at it, like Mike Evans. Some of those players do consistently produce good contested catch win rates season after season beyond that of randomness. But most players exist in this realm of randomness. We're at the point where I think it would be fairer to say that Justin Jefferson has an issue here than randomness is making the numbers look worse than they are. So that is potentially an issue. what's weird is that Jefferson is a weirdly strong receiver for his size. I mean, when you look at him stiff arm a safety that weighs, 30 pounds more than him, or if you take a look at him running through linebackers, like that's a strong dude. Like he's not Derrick Henry, but that is a strong. He's getting consistently 4 or 5 extra yards after the catch than I think a lot of receivers in his situation would. So he's a strong dude. And strength doesn't always correlate in the same way in every way, but like you'd think that some of that would translate in being able to go up to a ball and get it in a tight physical situation. But I don't know. It seems to be one of the few weaknesses of his game. He and the new ESPN measure for like wide receiver metrics. His open score is one of the best in the NFL. It's divided into 3 scores. There's a metric that uses next gen stats tracking data to determine how likely it is a receiver is going to be open on a particular route against a particular defense based on the location and angle of the defenders, and all of these other factors that you can capture from the chips. And they have a catch rating, which takes into account, whether or not the quarterback was pressured, how deep downfield it was, how close to the sideline the throw was, whether it was to the left, right, or the middle, how close the nearest defenders are at the time of throw, how close they are at the time of the catch, all of these other factors, right? And then they also look at yards after the catch, which look at a lot of these same factors, and they give a score at each of the individual categories, and they give a final score. Jefferson ranks something like 5th or 6th, maybe 7th in the NFL in 2022, and 4th or 3rd, I think, over the past 3 years in overall. But it's primarily driven by how well he gets open. His catch score is the weakest out of those 3 scores, and his yak score is just a little bit above receiver average, which I don't think is fair based on my observation. I think that he's quite a bit better at yak, but he primarily succeeds in the next gen stuff by getting open a lot better than almost any other receiver in the NFL. And so that's how he makes up for this contested catch problem that he seems to have by a couple of different metrics.
Next question is going to be from Roro, who asks, do we think there's much correlation between Kevin O'Connell leaving and the Rams' offensive implosion?
Oh, not really, because before Kevin O'Connell was the offensive coordinator, there were previous offensive coordinators for Sean McVay that were coordinating some really successful high-end offenses for the Rams. I mean, he was only the Rams offensive coordinator for 2020 and 2021. But, we had a 2019 Rams that succeeded, a 2018 Rams that succeeded. The 2018 Rams embarrassed a really good Mike Zimmer defense, right? Like that, I think, is pretty decent evidence that, it's not really like Kevin O'Connell that was driving this offense, especially because you've got the Sean McVay play caller. But you take a look at all of these like Sean McVay acolytes, I guess is maybe the best way to put it. Across the league, and they'd all been on kind of the offensive side of the ball. So people like Zach Robinson, people like Zach Taylor, people like Matt LaFleur's kind of in that area. People like Arthur Smith, they all had offensive contact with Sean McVay. Some of whom were the quarterbacks coach, some of whom were the offensive coordinator. Shane Waldron, for example, I believe was the 2019 pass game coordinator / offensive coordinator. He's the Seahawks offensive coordinator right now. They all were in that Rams staff, right? Before McVay even arrived there, much less, was, helping drive some of what that offense was doing. So no, I don't think that's it. I think that Matthew Stafford is cooked is more of it.
It is fun to see a team that has just spent all of its draft picks on now. We have to win now. We have to win now. Then they won, and now they're absolutely terrible. Like, that is the perfect example of they knew their window and went right in it. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not, I don't think, a super repeatable approach. I think the Rams got maybe a little bit lucky with it, but it certainly is kind of fun to watch a team go all in and then implode right afterwards.
Yeah.
They got what they wanted out of it, but very funny.
I'm sure the 8 fans they have in the Los Angeles area were very pleased at that championship celebration.
Yeah,
for the parade.
Exactly.
Winston asks, for Reef's Coven Corner, given that the Vikings once again won over a backup quarterback and that the Bills lost to inferior competition a week early, can we assume that the Vikings coaching coven has an internal schism about their next target, and how will that split result in our inevitable late season collapse. Update pending the results on Josh Allen's arm. What will the disagreement that causes a schism in the Vikings coven? What schisms that's going to be? That's going to lead to our inevitable demise. We are messing with some real deep stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, this is a thing where kind of the magics are so complicated and deep that you have to get them kind of prepared a good chunk of time before you actually play them, right? And that was one of the criticisms I had of the approach that the Vikings had to the occult, which was that they injured Dak Prescott too early. He came back and he'll be available for the Dallas Cowboys Vikings game. I believe they learned their lesson with that and waited a little bit before they'd kind of cast their spells and put Josh Allen in this tenuous situation. It's a little bit difficult. Josh Allen is a tank. And so it is a little bit tougher to get the magics coordinated correctly, but it seems like they did. And I don't think that there's any internal strife in the way the Vikings are handling, the witchcraft element of their game planning from week to week. So I don't know that there is an internal schism or split. I think that they're managing their targets, not on a week by week basis, but on like a quarter season by quarter season basis every couple of games. And they learn their lesson about kind of what will help and what may not help, what will be kind of a waste of energy, what won't be. And that's kind of what has led to the scenario where the Vikings might be able to play against Case Keenum, right? In the same way that they played against Taylor Heineke. Who knows what other Vikings, and Teddy Bridgewater, who knows what other Vikings quarterbacks they'll encounter as the season progresses.
All things are possible at this point, and we'll have more coming up soon next episode about what's happening with Josh Allen. But at this point, it's happened multiple times, and it's not weird that it's happened once. It's just weird that it keeps happening.
Right, exactly.
It's an interesting. Maybe this is just what happens this year. I don't know. Delta BC Dad asks, what would be better, the Vikings winning out or the Packers losing out? I don't mean for football purposes. I mean philosophically and maniacally.
I'd say that the Packers losing out, I think, has more spiritual satiation to it. I think that it'll feel a little bit more righteous in a world where the Packers lose out, because it's like slaying a dragon that's been bothering you for so long. The Vikings will always have opportunities to, make runs at the playoffs, but there's only one demise. And so you kind of want to be there for it as opposed to this kind of slow whimper. So I think that kind of helps a little bit. I think also it kind of just sets things like right because we're talking about, hey, how good could the Vikings possibly be? If you take a look at their net adjusted net yards per attempt, they're like 20th in the league. Yeah, whatever, right? That is an amount of ambiguity that is very annoying to deal with. Wouldn't have to worry about that if you're not guaranteeing that they win out, right? If the Vikings lose a little bit and the Packers lose out completely, I think Vikings fans are very happy. The Vikings continue to win and the Packers start picking up wins along the way. Yeah, Vikings fans will be happy. The Vikings are winning. But you don't really know kind of where this team really is. And now you're dealing with the fact that, hey, maybe the Packers just had this midseason slump. It was big enough not to let them get into the playoffs, but they could be something heading into 2023. We just want to eliminate that possibility entirely. I think the Packers losing out is better.
Next question is from B Percenter, who asks, how much of the Packers' struggles this season can be pinned directly on the Justice Mosqueda ownership group?
100%.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to ignore at this point. All the signs are clearly pointing to it. Plus, he's trying to tamper too. He's been trying to tamper with wide receivers, with quarterbacks now. Come on, you know better. Kyle Slaby asks, in 2018, the NFL began to question whether Aaron Rodgers was cooked. But a resurgent 2019 through 2021 Packers team, led by a new coach and a high-flying offense, chalked up that prior poor play to bad coaching and potential sabotage by Rodgers on McCarthy. However, the lack of Davante Adams, the breakout star of the LaFleur tenure, has left Rodgers unable to read even the simplest of progressions. Was Davante Adams the real MVP the last 3 years, and Rodgers merely a game manager?
Yeah, I don't see it as Is any other logical conclusion? Like, obviously, Devontae Adams was the brains behind the offense. Um, we're seeing the Las Vegas Raiders adapt their own offense back to kind of the Devontae Adams-led offense that we saw with the Packers, but it's taking a little bit of a while. I think Josh McDaniels is butting heads with Devontae Adams. We actually saw a quote from Devontae Adams today that tells us that they're not listening to the star quarterback / receiver when it comes to designing the offense. They should. That's going to revive the connection between Carr and Adams. They got them both drafted from Fresno State in the first place. But yeah, I mean, very clearly, Rodgers' inability to kind of read through basic progressions, figure out what the defense is doing, find the open receivers in the offense. A lot of that is because Devontae Adams isn't there, and specifically because Devontae Adams is not reading the field for Aaron Rodgers 100%.
It's an odd problem, but here we are.
Yeah, unique.
Beef Brewski asks, if you could pick a phrase to put on the back of helmets in the NFL, what phrase would you choose?
Sorry, I just remembered the pre-show suggestion that I had.
Sadly, I don't think that was going to work.
No, that's not going to work. Case Cookus.
Yep, Case Cookus works. Feed Me Seymour also works.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit long, but I still think you can do that one. Tommy Gunn asks, question 1. When Kevin O'Connell is inevitably fired mid-season sometime down the road, as many recent Viking coaches have been, who would the interim coach be a la Jeff Saturday style?
Goodness. Man, okay, so it has to be someone that's like beloved by the franchise and by the fans, is relatively uncontroversial, so you probably can't pick Matt Burke, right?
Nope.
To me, this screams Jim Kleinsasser.
See, I think the other thing that worked in Jeff Saturday's favor is he was technically being paid as a consultant. I don't know what he was consulting, but he was technically being paid already by Irsay.
Okay, so what was that? Aaron Henderson? I think Aaron Henderson is in the player development. Let me see in the Vikings front office, because I know that the Mike Harris, the tackle turned guard that started playing really well until he had a head injury that forced him to retire. He has been in a scouting fellowship with the Vikings and he's coached occasionally, but I don't think he's currently getting paid. Let's see. Okay, so Henderson was, I don't know if Henderson is anymore, was in the player development office. So that would have been good. I can't think of any other players off the top of my head that are currently well paid enough for you to say that guy is a consultant or that guy is playing a pretty important role. I know Bud Grant is a consultant.
They did just bring in Jared Allen to speak to the people during training camp.
That feels a little like
it's
a stretch.
A stretch, but so is having Jeff Saturday coach. So the all mullet defense could prove to be interesting.
Also, it wasn't Aaron Henderson; it was EJ Henderson. I'm sorry, and which makes more sense.
Yeah. Also, same question, but replacing Arif on the podcast.
James,
I'm sorry, Arif, but you would be replaced by Fred Smoot because you may be a national writer, but he covers everything that's not water. And
I can't argue that.
And also Case Cookus. Nolan Kaler asks, for Arif's cheesemonger corner, when the Lions bite off the kneecaps of the Packers, what kind of cheese do they taste? Do they prefer the soft nature of a David... God, this is so stupid. David Brie-Thiari? Or the harder texture of an aged Cheddar Rogers?
Oh, God.
Nolan, you know better. Don't do this.
Awful. I hurt inside now. Thank you, Nolan.
Yes. Chris asks, does there need to be a separate tournament for all of the additional Super Bowl winners thanks to Green Bay this year? Yes, it's as it turns out, it's called the playoffs because we're all headed there.
No, because the Vikings, well, I guess they lost their Super Bowl to the Eagles, but the Eagles still hold it, right? Like, because
Yes.
it's because the Eagles haven't lost, right? And it is only because the Vikings beat the Packers, which is the Vikings Super Bowl. It's not that the Packers create Super Bowls. It's that when the Vikings beat the Packers, Packers fans are bitter about it and say, actually, that was the Vikings Super Bowl. In which case, that adds another Lombardi to the trophy case that the Vikings have, the very extensive trophy case that they have. And then they lose that Super Bowl to any team that they lose to, and they've only lost to the Eagles. And they would not be able to gain that Super Bowl back until they play the Packers again. So there's not that many Super Bowls floating around, right? The Eagles have them all. So until the Vikings play the Packers again, there's really only one Super Bowl ring being handed out.
I enjoyed that the Daily Norseman was going to do this. They were going to track it. They'd even said, in the spirit of Norse code, we're going to track who the linear Super Bowl winner is this year. And then the Vikings lost it to the Eagles, and the Eagles just haven't lost yet. So, like, Chris was totally about doing it, and posted it, everything's ready to go. And then the Eagles just haven't lost it. So it's like, it was a wonderful idea. Unfortunately, it went to the team that's not going to lose this year.
Oh man, that would have been really fun to track.
Yeah. Leigh Cavassier asks, does Norse Code have an official stance on the correct post-win Kirk Cousins alter ego? Kirko, 8 Chains, Kirk Shiesty. Also,
Jesus.
what win total or result would be required for Kirk to wear only chains for the flight home? He is not Ric Flair. He is not going to do that.
So I like 8 Chains a lot. I mean, I hate all of these. Let me be clear, but I like 8 Chains a lot, right? Because it's it's his jersey number to play on 2 chains. But I feel like after 8 wins, it's tough to keep that moniker, right? Like obviously it's a reference to his jersey number, but he'll keep on adding chains after every win, right? And so 8 Chains just feels a little wrong. It's probably the best one out of all of these. Kirk Shiesty, I don't know, it's just a play on Joe Shiesty, right? Like it's not as cleanly Kirk. So I'm gonna go with 8 Chains. These all suck.
Don't hold back.
Yeah, I hope you feel bad for submitting the question.
Let's get into some witchcraft here, which is a fun sentence to say on this Vikings podcast. Luke Braun asks, O'Connell is a witch, right? It's time to verify and acknowledge that O'Connell is a witch, right? He has to be a witch. And
Yep.
for the real Jack, he asks, for a Reeves wicked witch and or wizard and or warlock corner. There's been a lot of discussion over the exact source of Kevin O'Connell's magic, including speculation that it came from an Eldritch bargain, making him a warlock. However, in Dungeons & Dragons, a warlock can derive their power from pacts made with a whole host of extraplanar entities, celestial, great old ones, infernal, the undead, amongst others, that are not always inherently evil. As a self-proclaimed investigative journalist, could Arif look into the specific nature of the Eldritch bargain that Kevin O'Connell has made based on his comments and how the Viking season has played out thus far without risk to himself or others in order to determine the exact nature of Kevin O'Connell's pact and what further effect it would have on the rest of the season and Kevin O'Connell's soul?
So here, the problem here is that we're accepting the canon of Dungeons and Dragons and using their delineation between warlock, wizard, witch, etc. Which, first of all, you didn't even throw a sorcerer in there. So, like, what are you doing, man? If Kevin O'Connell's a sorcerer, there is no bargain to be struck. He's just genetically magical, right? That's just how that works. Obviously, you're a Dungeons and Dragons expert. You know that's the real Jack. But I would venture to say that again, it does not seem like Kevin O'Connell traded away his soul or any soul-like objects to other entities in order to perform this magic. One, because he seems to be acting in accordance with his own incentive structure, right? We don't have any evidence that he is working to advance the goals of whatever entity he would have theoretically struck a bargain with, right? But two, there just isn't. We're talking about real witches here, man. We're not talking about Dungeons and Dragons, okay? You can't come in with your made up stuff.
Sorry, the sentence was said. We're talking about real witches on this. Just uh,
You can't
that's
come in with your made up stuff, man. Dungeons and Dragons, these are just stories.
yeah. Well,
We're talking about
tales,
witches.
epic
Tales,
tales.
even. Yeah.
Stampede. God. Stampede asks, another week where Arif's regressionist agenda grows ever weaker. He continues to deny the witchcraft at play here, given the anti-magicism pushed by Arif. I missed that when I read it earlier. When will Norse code find, suspend, and punish Arif and push him to take magic sensitivity training?
Hold on. I am defending magic here. Wow, what do you mean anti-magic? I'm talking about how we shouldn't treat witches as if they've struck some bargain with the devil. That's not true. That's just it's just their communication with the earth and the spirits around them. This is a pro-witch approach here. Anti-baby witch, totally different. Anti-specific witches, right? Whatever is going on here with Blue of Earth, right? But pro-witches. I want to be clear, it's not anti-magic. We're trying to remove some of the stigma surrounding magic.
Zero Dark O'Connell Mode asks, for Arif's momentum corner, is the way the Vikings are winning games sustainable? Also, do you foresee Josh Allen hurdling any unsuspecting Viking linebackers next weekend?
Not anymore.
I may have mentioned in the Discord, people were like trying to come up with the most annoying question, or the question that could possibly trigger you the most. A, it would have to involve momentum. B, it would have to involve sustainable. And C, it would have to involve you envisioning that gif of Josh Allen hurdling Anthony Barr.
Yeah, it's a couple episodes ago we established it's on my rules for some reason.
Yeah. So that's where we're at.
I get it. There's that one did strike a lot of chords, but it was all washed away by the fact that Josh Allen might not be playing due to witchcraft.
Yeah, that and a PCL. Tim Rizzo asks, gentlemen, if I had a random sum of money left over at the end of every month, let's say $8, totally arbitrary, can you list a few things I should do with these funds for short and long-term happiness that do not involve giving it to a broke billionaire?
Yeah, you could invest it for sure. You could buy 2 insomnia cookies.
2 very nice bougie cookies, yes.
They're just cookies. The fact that they're delivery doesn't mean that most food now is delivery. I want to be clear: the delivery does not make it bougie. It's not bougie. They're just cookies. They bake cookies. You buy them. You eat them.
Cookies being delivered. It's by definition bougie. You could light the money on fire if you wanted to try to keep it from the man. You could buy a bougie beer, but it wouldn't be delivered. Yeah. But you could buy a bougie beer at a bar, or you could probably get 2 over at Union 32 Craft House on November 17th, about 7:30 p.m. They have a fantastic automatic wall of beers. You just flash your card on it, they charge it, and they just go off of how many fluid ounces you put into the glass. It's fantastic. It's space age technology, folks, and you can do that while seeing Arif and James over at Union 32 Craft House, where we're giving away 2 tickets to the Vikings Cowboys game.
Incredible! Oh my god, shameless.
I'm getting better at this since I've been doing ad reads at volleyball and now basketball games. So this is only getting worse. Don from Ohio asks our final question: when I win the Powerball tonight, how much would it cost me to shut down the Norse Code Discord and the podcast to save humanity from this weekly hell?
I don't think our price is that high, right? What's the Powerball? Like a couple billion, like 1.2 billion?
It's nearly 2 billion. I think after taxes, it's still a considerable amount of money. I don't know what the tax situation would be in Ohio. By the way, my favorite new username on the Discord is Luke Braun from Ohio.
That one's so funny. That one is so funny.
But
yeah, so this is a situation where if you assume you're the only winner, it is in theory rational to buy a ticket because the percentage of potential winners versus the cost of a ticket and the payout of, let's say, after taxes, it's $1 billion. It's higher. The expected value is higher. And so this is kind of one of those areas where people are buying the Powerball, but it assumes that you're going to be the only winner, right? But we will not be making any assumptions that are generous to Don and ungenerous to us. So we will assume, for Don's sake even, that he is the sole winner of $2 billion from maybe $1 billion post-tax. All you would have to give us to get us to shut up, $10 million. Easy, I think.
I think that's a nice number. Each, obviously, for obvious reasons.
Right, no, clearly. Yeah, just want to be clear. Yeah, I don't want James touching my $10 million.
No, absolutely. I don't want you anywhere near it. Tell you what, if you give me $10 million, I'll never talk to Arif again.
Simple. And that Discord server? Gone.
Yeah, nuked from space. I think, I think we did some good work today. Speaking of Arif, what do you have to plug, Arif?
So I've got a piece coming up about the Jim Irsay decision of all things. Of course, I've got my weekly column breaking down this week's actions and any trends that are occurring across the NFL, called the Extra Points column. It drops every Monday. That one's already out. You can check that out. And then I'll have a piece breaking down quarterbacks sometime later in the week. Those are my primary pieces, obviously, over at ProFootballNetwork.com, which you can find. My article is ProFootballNetwork.com/author/Ahazan. You'll find kind of all of the game breakdowns that I did, this week, and any takes on upcoming news. We had a roundtable on the decision to fire what's his name, Frank Reich. Which quickly became irrelevant as Jeff Saturday kind of overtook the news cycle.
That is still just...
Yeah, so we're going to have a Jeff Saturday specific piece up tomorrow.
What a fun time to be a Colts... No, fun is the opposite of what I'm thinking of.
What an interesting time.
Yeah, let's go with that. Well, for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that the Vikings are not to be trusted. And we'll be back later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of Pro Football Network, and he can be found at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a few different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merchandise. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
Hey, all things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.